My name is Ruth Dyer, and I'm the assistant to the provost here at Kansas State University. And I've been given the distinct pleasure of welcoming you to the 13th Dorothy L. Thompson Civil Rights Lecture. This series is named in honor of the late Dorothy Thompson in recognition of her abiding respect for all people and for her profound commitment to fairness and equity. Ms. Thompson served the university for 13 years as the Director of Affirmative Action and then for 7 years as the Associate University Attorney. The Office of the Provost and many co-sponsors and patrons who are listed in tonight's program sponsor this series. Contributions from these co-sponsors and patrons make it possible to bring distinguished individuals such as tonight's speaker, Barbara Bergmann, to our campus. We have two co-chairs for the Dorothy L. Thompson Lecture Series. One is Sheila Hockhauser, who is a lawyer in private practice here in Manhattan, and the other is Dr. Jim Hamilton, who is the head of the Department of Philosophy. Dr. Hamilton is busy teaching a course this evening, doing his duty, so to speak, so he's not able to be with us. Also seated up here are Sue Peterson, Assistant to the President and Director of Governmental Relations, Jackie Spears, Director of Women's Studies, and Jane Roulette, Director of Unclassified Affairs and University Compliance and a member of the Dorothy Thompson Lecture Series Committee. These three women are all members of the University Equity Issues Committee, and they have an active interest in the topic of Ms. Bergmann's lecture this evening. At this time, I am most pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Barbara Bergmann. Dr. Bergmann received her PhD from Harvard University, and she is Professor Emerita of Economics at the University of Maryland and at American University in Washington, D.C. She has written and spoken extensively on women's issues, social policy, labor economics, microsimulation, the economics of college sports, and new methodologies for economics. She is currently working on a book entitled Child Care Needs: What Should We Ask of Government? As well as Is Social Security Broke? A cartoon guide explaining the Social Security system. She is the author of several other books, including The Economic Emergence of Women, In Defense of Affirmative Action, and Saving Our Children from Poverty: What the United States Can Learn from France. Dr. Bergmann has been a senior staff member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors during the Kennedy administration, and she has served as the president of several professional organizations, including the Eastern Economic Association, the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics, the International Association for Feminist Economics, and the American Association of University Professors. The title of her lecture this evening is Bringing About Equality Between Women and Men: What Needs to Be Done. I know I am anxious to hear what she has to say. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Bergmann.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Civil rights is really my favorite topic. I'd like to start out by looking just very briefly at where we've come from in terms of gender relations, where we are now, and where we might be going. And most of the time will be spent discussing the world of the future and what we should try to structure it like. Let's look at the past first. Say the world as it was when I came into the world, which was just about 3 or 4 years after women had been given the vote. In the unequal world from which we hope to be emerging, men and women have had radically different lives and functions. Prior to World War II, which for those young people who don't know, ended in 1945, most women in the West were isolated from the sphere of the money exchange economy, isolated from political life, isolated from adventure, competition, artistic creation, entrepreneurship, science, sport, the life of the mind, the pursuit of excellence, and the development and deployment of any special talents. Those were all reserved for men. In other words, they were isolated from everything that, for better or worse, differentiates our world from the world of our cave-dwelling ancestors. Only one occupation was customary for women, while men, or at least some men in developed societies, have had a wide choice of lifestyles and occupations. Women really have had, in the past, a caste-like position of a caste. And what is a caste system? It's a system where when a baby is born, you know what occupation it's going to be. So when I was born, they knew I was going to be a housewife. The position, lives, and functions of women in the world of segregated assignments was not simply different from those of men. The duties assigned to them are the most repetitive, messy, and boring. Dealing with the excrement of the very young and the very old has been assigned to them exclusively. In the underdeveloped countries, where physically onerous duties such as carrying water are common, such duties are typically assigned to women. This is not to say that the services whose delivery is assigned to women are unimportant, intrinsically dishonorable, or dispensable. Quite on the contrary, they are vital life support activities, and some of them take skill, talent, and intelligence to do well. The sphere of the women's world, as it has been called, certainly has some satisfactions associated with it. Yet that world could be, and often is, an unpleasant and even a dangerous place. Its inhabitants have been subordinated to another's unchecked will, subject to violence from their domestic partner without recourse, in danger of being deserted and left destitute. On this matter of domestic violence, I might tell you that I heard a talk by an attorney who was interested in domestic violence a number of years ago, and she said, you know, there's only one factor in a case which will guarantee that the police will arrest an abusive spouse, and that has nothing to do with having to go to the emergency room with a broken jaw or anything of that sort. It's if a car is damaged. Anti-feminists argue that women choose or should be forced to choose their isolation from the public and money exchange spheres. In doing so, women ensure good arrangements for the nurturing of the young, a concern that evolutionary processes allegedly have hardwired into their heads millions of years prior to our emergence from cave dwelling. All the rest follows from that choice, and there's nothing to regret or fix, according to these people. Another less benign explanation of women's condition, as it exists in most of the world today still, and as it did here when I came into the world. Another less benign explanation draws on the observation that you don't have to be a child nurturer to be excluded from valued, profitable, and entertaining activities, marginalized, devalued, and subject to physical threats. Being of African origin in the United States, Hutu in Rwanda, Muslim in India, Jewish in many places at many times will do just as well. If history shows anything, It's that people readily seize and exploit opportunities to dominate others and will use any difference as an excuse to mark off for treatment as a subordinated caste, people displaying that kind of difference. Sex differences are simply the handiest differences that get used in that way, but not the only ones. In many human societies, the modes of production are such that it makes economic sense for certain duties to be carried on more commonly by women than by men. This is particularly the case in those societies in which fertility is under poor control and a high share of the productive work takes strength. Obviously, that is a situation which we have left, happily. However, the segregation of the sexes by economic duties is in most human societies, and still including this one, carried much further and policed much more rigorously than economic logic would dictate. Instead of people taking on the productive work that their talent and taste would dictate, regardless of sex, we have a rigid and exclusive assignment of each kind of work to one sex or the other. Whatever the origin or justification of these sex differences in activity, and in modern society where differences in physical strength no longer matter, there's very little justification, they themselves become a cause of differentiation in status. Where are we now? Let's leave the gloomy past and ask where we are now. The caste-like assignment of each gender to separate worlds has eased considerably since World War II in the United States and in much of Europe, in the sense that women have felt freer to enter into the activities of men's world, and some men have felt willing and able to welcome them there. The integration of the men's world, however, is grossly incomplete, however. A sociologist, Tomaskevich Devi, has done a survey of employed people in North Carolina. He asked them about the sex and race of the people who worked with them, doing the same kind of work they did and having the same job title. He found that women were not excluded from any broad categories of work. However, a large majority of people work exclusively with people of their own sex. Jobs in which 100% of the incumbents were male and jobs in which 100% of the incumbents were female altogether accounted for 70% of all jobs. In another 16% of all jobs, segregation by sex was not total, but nearly so. The integration of men into the duties of the female world is likewise far from complete. It is commonly believed that it has been harder to integrate the home front than it has been to integrate the world of paid work. And I think that that has been true. We can ask why that is. I think one reason is that at home, every couple has to fight out the allocation of housework. There's nothing in the public sphere to help them to work out an equitable sharing of the household tasks. I don't watch television, but last I looked, there was nothing on television about that issue. It doesn't appear in the movies. It doesn't appear in novels. Certainly the talk shows don't take it up. So every couple has to work that out for themselves. So if we're hoping for a big transformation of the household in terms of who does what, I think we're going to be waiting a long time. The total amount of housework done in the past has been reduced through the purchases of substitute for do-it-yourself housework and changes in household consumption of services. And the most obvious example of that is the coming into existence of the fast food industry. which has for millions and millions of people displaced home cooking to a very considerable extent. Men have increased their share, but about half of their increased share is due to the decrease in total housework, due particularly to these food, takeout food and delivered food. I may say, just yesterday, I started for the very first time ordering my groceries on the web. So. Another part of men taking over, of course, is the increase in the proportion of married families with two earners. In considering how far the integration of men into the female world has gone, we also have to take account of the high and growing rate of single motherhood, of which I will have more to say later on. But of families with children, in 97, 28% did not contain married couples. And it's well understood that this phenomenon represents a withdrawal of many men from the financial responsibility for the children they engender. What is less understood is that it also represents a huge abstention by men from any contribution to the tasks of running households. The hardest part of being a single mother, aside from the lack of money, is that you have no one to share the housework with. So that's pretty much where we are now. The question is, where should we be going? And I'd like to propose three possibilities and discuss which I think A is the most likely and B the one we should be aiming for. One, which is, I think, in the best style these days, at least in theory, is the integration of both the male world and the female world. In other words, women coming into the male world on equal terms, namely the workplace, and men participating in the household on an equal basis with women, with their spouses or with their partners. In the workplace, men and women would have a similar distribution of jobs and household tasks, similar distribution of jobs, and there would be a similar distribution of household tasks. Family-friendly policies on the part of employers would be the rule to allow both men and women to participate in both spheres. I think most feminists would favor that. A second type of future is what I call a high commodification route. As I mentioned, a lot of the things that used to be done in the home are now being done for pay outside. Fast food, again, being the most obvious and most recent of them. Actually, if we look back to the times where we emerged down from the trees, that was a time, and it must have gone on for hundreds of thousands of years, where every family did for themselves. Whatever they had, they produced themselves. There was no trade. As people became capable of more and more varied products were produced, they found that it was worthwhile to trade. and people started specializing in the production of certain goods and services. And little by little, almost everything has come out of the household production and gone into the essentially, you might call it commercial production. These days we would call it for money production. What's left is just a little bit. What is it? It's cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Laundry of clothes is a funny example that went out of the home and is now coming back. That is, it has come back. Washing machines brought some of it back, and my daughter tells me now you can even throw something into the washing machine and get your clothes dry cleaned. So, but for the most part, the movement of economic activity has been from the home to the money economy. So a high commodification route would essentially get rid of housework. That doesn't mean to say that we would all be living in hotels, although we could. But, for example, all cleaning within the house would, for example, be done by hired labor, as it is still for many of us right now. Among the things that make that difficult, that make the commodification, for example, of cleaning services difficult, is the fact that the commercial services, the organized services, have to compete against people who evade taxes. And so it's easier to hire cheaper to hire someone who evades taxes, but then you have this messy business of being an employer, which most people are not used to and do not like, for good reason. So there are bars to high commodification, but they could be gotten over. High commodification would mean, again, that child care would be non-parental. All child care would be non-parental. So most child rearing, cooking, meal cleanup, house cleaning, laundry services would be purchased in such a regime. In the money economy, these former household tasks would be done by paid employees of both sexes. In this regime, some of the tasks now performed on an unpaid basis would be bought from business enterprises or the self-employed out of family income. The rest would be purchased by government and provided to families, or would be subsidized by government through vouchers, tax breaks, and other mechanisms, as, for example, some child care is now. Certainly the public schools are an example of government provision of services. Of course, again, there's been a little bit of a return with the advent of the fad for homeschooling. And I said to a friend of mine a couple of months ago, I'll bet that soon they're going to have home college. And I believe somebody has started one. So the second possible way things could go would be we give up the possibly hopeless task of making men do more housework, and we just get rid of housework. Well, I'm glad somebody's. And of course, that would mean that women would be free to go wholeheartedly into the male world and compete there. There is a third way, and I call that separate but more equal. And of course, that title should warn you that it really isn't more equal. But there are a lot of people who call themselves feminists who go this route, at least partially. And that route is the following. We would still have a male world and a female world, and they would still stay pretty separate. But the respect, security, and rewards enjoyed by the denizens of the female world would increase. Some men might specialize in tasks of the female world, but we would expect this to be rare. So those I think are the three possibilities. In considering which of these regimes we should aim at, we have to consider the desirability, that is, whether each regime would indeed produce sex equality, and what its other desirable and undesirable features might be. We also have to consider its attainability. The separate but more equal regime, where housewives get to be better protected and more honored and so on. By the way, part of the Honor Housewives movement is a tremendous interest in getting housework included in the gross domestic product. And this is something that interests a lot of people, and it has always puzzled me. We have an email network among the feminist economists, and every once in a while I'll write something about child care or affirmative action, not too much interest, but somebody writes something about getting housework counted in the national income accounts, and immediately the emails light up like crazy. Now, why anybody might think that changing the way the gross domestic product is computed, and I'm an economist, and I myself never notice from one year to the next what it has, what good they think that would do in the real world, I don't know. But as I say, it seems to energize a lot of people. Maybe somebody can explain that to me. In any case, the separate but more equal world is the obvious first candidate for elimination. Women are voting with their feet by moving massively into paid work. And one might argue that it is the move to paid work that has raised women's status and women's own sense of independence, and self-worth. While lack of security or honor for the traditional womanly role may have played a part in motivating this move of women into the workplace, it is probably the attractions of the male sphere that have done most to motivate the move of women towards it. Monetary reward, more interesting ways to spend time, the possibilities for independence. It is hard to believe, it's hard for me to believe anyway, although maybe that's wish fulfillment, it's hard to believe that women would move back to the home if more security and respect for the housewife role materialized. And by the way, we've got a lot of people who are campaigning for that. And it's not just the Promise Keepers. Large numbers of right-wing foundations who are, for example, suggesting that the only way to raise children is for women to stay home. Whatever the effect of increasing the security, respect, or rewards of the woman's world might be, not much progress has been made in bringing it about. Advances have been made in some localities in the treatment by the police of spouse abuse as a crime, and federal law now requires that pension payments continue to the widowed spouse after the death of the spouse who was the primary beneficiary. Moves are afoot in some states to make divorce more difficult. And I might say, as you know, Louisiana instituted a new form of marriage, which is slightly harder to dissolve. And my hunch was that most people getting married in Louisiana would choose that. Because it would be embarrassing to say to one's fiancé, oh, let's have the form of marriage where divorce is easy. Nevertheless, I believe less than 5% of the couples in Louisiana have opted for this new form of marriage, which shows that as a predictor of social trends, I leave a lot to be desired. A more practical and far-reaching suggestion has been the proposal for paid parental leave. And I've even had some arguments today with people here who have told me that this is a very important thing for women to have, and it's something that the university ought to provide for the faculty, for example. I've just finished publishing an article against paid parental leave on the grounds that only women would take it, or only women would take most of it, and it would intensify gender differences in careers. And also, for those families who have low income, particularly single mothers who have to work, it's not fair to pay some people to stay home. We've just gotten rid of welfare. And I think most people in this country feel that it's a good thing we have, that everybody ought to in some way be connected to the labor market. I'm not happy at how welfare reform has gone in terms of the support services that have been provided. For example, only 1 in 10 children who are eligible for supported childcare are getting it. And that's an essential ingredient for a successful transition off welfare. Nevertheless, we have just had an episode where we have taken the support for women to stay home and raise their own children, do their own child care. That's what welfare really was. Welfare was a big child care program. We've abolished that, and it would be strange then to say, okay, the single moms we won't allow, but you married moms, you go right to it. So I find the drive for paid parental leave for me, in my opinion, that is a mistake in terms of gender equality. And, you know, there are some advantages to it, but there are grave disadvantages. And I think anything, from the point of view of women and women's lives, anything which increases gender segregation is against their interest. So, to sum up, more honor, security, and reward for the denizens of the women's world is not likely to advance significantly. More importantly, such advances, were they to occur, would have dubious value for equality. We would be left with what is basically a caste system based on largely irrelevant physical characteristics, with all of the stunted life chances and status differences such systems produce. I've had a lot of experiences of status differences in my life, particularly meeting around my suburban neighborhood, men who don't know that I'm a distinguished professor. And I see the way they treat me. And I know that I have no status in their eyes because I am a woman. In choosing between the integration of both worlds, that is the remaining two options, the integration of both worlds and high commodification, the former has the benefit of a more personalized caretaking of children and perhaps elders, while the latter is probably of easier attainment. In fact, it's going on of its own accord. That's the way things are tending. You know, the child care industry has grown enormously, as well as the food industry. The benefit of a more has a more I'm sorry the striking growth in single parenthood, however, creates a perhaps fatal problem for the integration of both worlds model. Since in a significant and growing number of families with children, there is no second parent to integrate into the home-based tasks. The single parent who takes a job is forced into the high commodification regime, often without the monetary resources necessary to be successful. A big advance towards high commodification would occur if a significant program of government financial support for non-parental child care were to be enacted. And of course, we know that Mr. Gore has suggested universal pre-kindergarten. Well, pre-kindergarten, also Head Start, are always presented as education, not mere babysitting. Nevertheless, if you think that a child has 6 years before it enters the first grade, a year of full-time kindergarten, a year of full-time preschool at age 4 takes care of 2/6, 1/3 of the child care problem. So even though these things are presented as educational moves purely, and any babysitting that goes on at the same time we better not mention, is a move in that direction. Government help, financial help to low-income parents in financing child care would inevitably require some measure of help to parents in at least the lower middle class. And as a matter of fact, in the book I have forthcoming, I and my co-author are recommending essentially a $50 billion a year program to subsidize child care. If, as I believe is the case, high commodification is on the way, will it bring equality of women and men? Not necessarily. At least 3 things are needed: an end to discrimination in employment, highly competitive behavior by women, and extra resources from government for families who are raising children. Women's competitiveness will have to be exercised in the political fights it will take to end discrimination and to obtain government programs that will finance child raising, as well as in the competition for good careers. Now, I think, let me pause here and talk a bit about the resources that are needed from government. Mr. Gore and Mr. Bush are fighting about what to do with the surplus, and one says, let's give it back to the public in tax cuts, and the other one says, let's reduce the federal debt down to nothing. There is a third way, and that is to spend it on the country's needs. And there are many unmet needs. As I mentioned, in the child care field, the present child care programs which we have in every single state, those programs have only enough money to fund child care for 1 in 10 of the children who are eligible for it. You know, the term entitlement has been made into a dirty word. What is an entitlement? It's a government program that automatically has enough money to give the benefits to everybody who is on the books eligible to them. And somehow or other that has been, along with the words like liberal and I suppose a few others, made into, affirmative action is another one, has been made into bad words. But when you think of it, here we have a government program which says people who, for example, earn $20,000 a year and have 2 children should get $10,000 worth of help in their child care. And some people get it and other people don't because there just isn't enough money. So that's the kind of thing we ought to be spending the surplus on. Also, of course, to get every single child and their parents into health insurance. And then after we do that, maybe we can work on the non-parents. And also, of course, to do something about affordable housing. All those 3 things, and we have, by the way, housing programs, again, which are not fully funded, which are very far from fully funded. So these are really important needs. Again, remember, 20% of our children are in poverty. This is, of course, in part a gender issue, because they are living with women, and women cannot earn as much as men can earn under present circumstances. So these are programs which, in my view, we ought to be asking for and working towards, instead of giving tax cuts to people who are filled to the gills with capital gains, and or paying down the debt, which is the equivalent of paying off the mortgage and telling your kid, no, you can't go to college because I have to pay off the mortgage. There is a tendency on the part of many feminists to advocate the construction of a new world of exchange that would be very different from the male world of today. Less competitive, more compassionate, less hierarchical, more personal, perhaps more loving. In thinking about that, it's worthwhile remembering that the male world runs on principles that have evolved since cave-dwelling days. If the male world is hierarchical, competitive, emotionally cold, perhaps that is the most effective way to carry on its kind of business. Even if that is not true, and if its business could be carried on as well, or almost as well, or fairly satisfactorily, in a more democratic, cooperative way, women are not going to be in a position to make a change in the way the male world is run, unless they achieve positions of power. To achieve that power, it is likely they must play the male game, at least until a gentler and warmer way of human interactions evolves and becomes standard through their new influence. So where I come out then is that we are advancing, and we ought to advance, towards a world in which essentially women have the same kind of lives that men do now. Now, in order for this to happen, we have to have our new president say, the era of big government is back. Because the financing of the things we need, that we will need in that new world, has to be done by government. If you think of a single mother earning perhaps the median income of $19,000 with 2 children, that's perhaps twice the minimum wage. Imagine she has 2 preschool children. She needs about $11,000 or $12,000, probably more like $13,000 in many parts of the country to put a roof over her head and buy food. And child care for this single mother costs perhaps $16,000. Can't be done on that salary. So in this new world where women are to be equal, in this new world where I unfortunately believe more women are going to be single mothers, and I don't think there's any way we can prevent that. And in any case, we can't be unkind to their children because they are not responsible. In that kind of a world, we do need big government to come across with these big programs. So that's what I foresee. I think that I will, I hope, live to see the return of big government. Even when it comes, it'll probably come, as they say, on little cat's feet. They won't announce it, but it will come. And let me just say I'm hopeful. Perhaps I have an unusual point of view. I enjoy operating in the male world, and I've always enjoyed it. And I think most women will also. I think to some degree children will be brought up with paid care. Recent research suggests that almost any kind of care makes very little difference in terms of children's attachment to their parents and psychological well-being and so on. So I view this new era, which I believe we have coming, with quite a bit of optimism, and I'm looking forward to witnessing it. Thank you. Sure.
Dr. Bergmann will take questions from the audience.
In my professional experience, a great many single mothers are really children themselves. And that lots of times the fathers who have deserted their children are really much older perpetrators. Can you speak to preventing this sort of child abuse and possibly reducing the rate of single motherhood in this manner?
Well, I'm not sure that there is any efficacious way to do that. I mean, they do it very easily in Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, but we don't want to go to that. I don't think you can prevent teenagers from getting pregnant by 25-year-old men. As I say, I think it's quite difficult. I think that when women can look forward to better and more interesting and more lucrative jobs, there'll be less teenage pregnancy. But I really think that marriage is an institution, and I hate to say this because I'm happily married, and I think it is the very best state, that marriage is foundering as the basis for supporting reproduction. Going back again to the time we came down from the trees, if we were anything like the chimps, the mothers did all of the work of supporting the child, tending the child, feeding the child, and giving the child what it needed. Somehow or other, men, at some time in our history, got roped into providing very significant support for their children, or at least for those of their children that they officially had to acknowledge. Now we seem, just in this very modern era, to be going in the other direction. Millions of men have reduced their commitment to the children they sire. Now, one thing that might do some good is a different regime for child support. So if you think of what is child support, it's a payment that's made by an absent parent to the custodial parent. Of course, it's part of many divorce settlements, but child support is also paid where a child is born out of wedlock and its paternity has been established. A number of years back, there was quite a lot of agitation to improve child support regime because it was found that a very high proportion of child support orders that were going through the court were not being honored. And it's a very cumbersome process to get them honored. Now, how could that be improved? Well, I have a utopian scheme for that too. We make it part of the tax and transfer system. Internal Revenue collects the child support on a formula, like a tax formula, based only on the absent parent's income, and sends a nice check to the custodial parent. Now, that might very well deter many men from causing pregnancies if this were done with greater dispatch. I'm certainly in favor of it, and we've been moving in that direction. The federal government is not responsible for it, but it's been bribing the states to do things like computerize their system, to put in formulas instead of discretion by judges as to what the amount should be, and so on. So we've been moving in that direction, but it hasn't gone fast enough to really make a difference in people's behavior. I think men's interest in contraception would increase notably if some sort of regime of that sort could be put in. Yes?
In a world of high commodification, where everything is done outside the home, like the cooking, the cleaning, and the childcare, how would you keep those services from becoming predominantly female and minority again?
Well, they would certainly, the answer, of course, and here I haven't addressed the issue, is through vigorous programs to prevent discrimination in employment. I am the author, as was mentioned, of the book on affirmative action, and I believe that affirmative action is, by the way, alive and well, certainly in the corporate sector, and has accomplished a great deal. It's accomplished a great deal for women. It's accomplished, I think, quite a bit for people of color. And so that would be the case. I think the example of Sweden is one that, for example, gives us the problem that you mentioned. Sweden, virtually all the women, except very new mothers, are in the labor force, but Sweden has one of the most sex-segregated labor forces in the world. I attributed that to the fact they have a year's parental leave, paid parental leave. And that's one of the sources of my opposition to it. But my view of where we want to go in the high commodification route is obviously that the world of commodities, the activities of the world of commodities, need to be integrated by race and sex as well. I'm also in favor, really, of some sort of wage regime that pays high salaries for disagreeable jobs. You know, in New York, people vie to become garbage collectors. Why? Because the wages are very good. Yes.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
They kind of relate, I think. One, I remember a history teacher saying that something to the extent that she hopes that we would all be feminists by 1960 standards, and I might agree with that. I was wondering what your definition of feminism is today, and also I know many women who want to be full-time mothers, especially when their kids are young, and does the mainstream idea of feminism now tell them that is bad?
Okay, you know, I would characterize mainstream, you know, most feminists that I know would say women should be whatever they want to be. That's what feminism is, the right to be whatever you want to be. I disagree. So I'm out of the mainstream. In my view, we need a regime of equality. And I don't believe that separate spheres can possibly produce equality. Does that answer your question? Yes.
I have a question on your thoughts about paid parental leave. And I'm wondering about your opinions. You said earlier that you think that mostly women would be interested in taking the parental leave and not men. And I'm wondering if you could expand on that.
Okay, well, the experience, you know, it's always good to get out of the realm of theory and into the realm of experience. Sweden has a provision that, you know, either partner can take the leave. And as a matter of fact, I believe the father is forced to take some minimal amount or lose it. But the fact is that men take very little. And they tend to take it combined with the fishing vacation and that sort of thing. So, you know, what you have to face here is that men are losing, have lost some privileges. They've lost the privilege of monopolizing the good jobs, the interesting jobs, the jobs that pay well. They've lost that privilege partially. They really haven't lost the privilege of being exempt from changing diapers. And they're going to, as I said, in the within family battle as to who does what, a woman is all by herself. There's no public help. There's no public opinion help. So where you have a state where the women are going to do, the men are not going to want to share the parental leave. They can rationalize that by saying, well, I make $1 for every 80 cents you make, so if I take the leave, we have to give up $1. If you take the leave, we only have to give up 80 cents. Besides which, you like this kind of work better, and you're better at it. So the fact is that in a place like Sweden, men take very little parental leave. Yes.
You say there's only 1/10 of child care that's needed, it's almost supplied. And if you would change that, I imagine like big government.
Supply, what's being not supplied is government subsidies to parents, yes.
Oh, I see. So you want to have government pay for that? Would there be enough of supply of childcare, workers, educators, to supply for it? To supply that?
Well, I'll tell you, children are being cared for, and let's hope every child in the United States is being cared for 24 hours a day. So it's not a matter so much of getting the children cared for. It's getting them cared for in a decent way, in a way where there's oversight, in a way where there's a licensing authority, and in a way which doesn't break the budget of the family. So it's, you know, if you look at today's Washington Post, you'll see a little story which appears quite frequently about a babysitter who had this baby from a mother. She went out shopping and left her boyfriend with the baby, and 10 minutes was all it took for the baby to die. And he was convicted of something or other. That's the kind of child care we want to get children out of. And that's the kind of child care, I think the caretaker that was supposed to be with the baby was 17 years old. So this mother had left her child with a 17-year-old child, and who handed it over to her abusive boyfriend. Now, your question of if we increase the subsidies for child care, in other words, if we start giving money for child care, will the supply of child care increase? Well, the supply of child care is like any other commodity. It's very seldom that you get a shortage of anything for which there's money to pay. What are the shortages we have? Well, occasionally we have gas shortages when people go crazy about oil supplies. Tickets for winning football teams. Tickets for rock concerts of fabulously successful artists, if you want to call them that. What else? Hit shows, okay? The American economy, thank God, is not one where you expect to have shortages. So if there's more money there to pay for good child care, the entrepreneurs of America will supply it. Now, there is a for-profit child care industry, and it is just raring to go to expand. So I think the answer to your question is yes, there would be an expansion of supply. All you have to do is take care of the demand side, and supply will spring into being. Yes?
Well, I would agree wholeheartedly with your proposal for government subsidies, but I would probably extend that further and ask the government to subsidize paid parental leave for everyone, including the single mothers who would previously be on welfare. I find that in the analysis where one speaks about commodification of household tasks, that to equate, caring and, passing one's values on to children on the one hand with cleaning toilets on the other is perhaps an overly pat sort of equation. And I think that when one does away with parental leave, particularly when one does away with parental leave for women in the lower ends of the economic spectrum, then caring for one's own children becomes an upper-class pleasure. And I think that that's dangerous for women, because I think that in the rush towards equality in the world of work, that while women are gaining the pleasures of work which men have enjoyed for eons, I think that women run the risk of losing the pleasures of rearing children.
Okay, well, I'm delighted there's a very eloquent expression of the exact opposite of what I've been saying, and it may be persuasive with most of you. The question is, well, first of all, which way should we go and which way are we going? Obviously, we are going towards higher commodification. Okay? I mean, that's pretty obvious. Now, I could be mean and say, well, people are voting with their feet. But paid parental leave is a way of keeping the separate spheres. And my own view of women's advancement is that if you keep separate spheres, you lose. Now, you say it's worth losing it, maybe. It's worth losing it for the children's sake. What I say is half those children are girls. It's not worth their while to trade mommy at home for an assured life as a housewife, a forced life as a housewife. So it's a matter of trade-off, and it's a matter of what's most important to you. I'm telling you what my values are, and I'm saying, by the way, the world is moving in the direction that I think best. So I'm optimistic. But I may say that countries such as Holland and Germany, which have very lavish provision for supporting the care of children by at-home parents, by at-home mothers actually, are going in the other direction. So that's the way things are moving. And as I say, getting rid of welfare moves in the direction of paid childcare. But really, the research that is beginning to come out shows that from the point of view of the children, from the point of view of the children's development, their emotional condition, their learning, what have you, who their parent is very important. But the kind of care they have during the working day, assuming that it's of halfway decent quality, is not important. It doesn't. Now, some children have parents who can't really attend to their development. And those children particularly need paid care. I don't really think, I mean, there are some wonderful people raised by mothers on welfare, but there are plenty of poor kids raised on welfare who really have not had a good nurturance. And so I think putting those kids into paid care, assuming it's good paid care, perhaps that's too big an assumption, but nevertheless, putting those kids into paid care will do them a favor. Yes?
There are other alternatives, such as you find in a lot of socialist countries. And I'm thinking mainly of the kibbutz, where they had child care during the day and went home.
Well, of course, the kibbutzes are pretty much kaput. And in their original form, the children lived apart from the parents and did not go home at night. Now, the kibbutz was supposed to, the kibbutz, for those of you who don't know about it, was a form of Israeli sort of communitarian cooperative living in which everybody sort of lived on a farm and they had a cash crop and everybody participated in doing all the services. And nobody worked outside the kibbutz. Well, it turned out, of course, that after a while, all of the tasks were sex segregated. That is, caring for the children was women's work, doing the cooking and cleaning was women's work, and the men attended to the management and the farming with farm implements. So, you know, I don't think that's a very good example. But I think there are some other examples. I think, for example, in one of my books I mentioned that the Swedes, under the influence of Gunnar and Alva Myrdal, had the idea of apartment houses equipped with all kinds of family services so that nobody would have to do any housework. All the housework services would be presumably located, for example, in a mall on the first floor. You'd have the dry cleaner and the daycare center and so on. And just like a hotel, the rooms would be cleaned by professionals working on it. So that's another form of doing it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There are. Yes.
Well, I also have to take issue with your position on paid parental leave. It seems to assume that if you, as a mother, say, take the parental leave for the first few months of the kid's life, then you are stuck being the primary caregiver forever. Whereas my own husband's a very proficient diaper changer. Even at a period when we had two of him in diapers. So it's not as if, in my experience, it's not as if you take those first few months off, that it has to set the pattern for the entire childhood.
Well, no, I don't think so, but we're not talking about a few months. I don't object to 6 weeks. What I object to is a year, okay? Now, by the way, I think once we moved into the high commodification regime, we might decide that we need more at-home time, okay? And then we could apportion it equally. But there are problems with that, and I can certainly appeal to the faculty members. Where you're in a competitive profession, you just can't do it. So that if we had both mothers and fathers engaging in hands-on child care, people with children it wouldn't be just the woman that was giving up her career, it would be both of them. And so I think for people like that, it won't work. Yes?
Are you willing to speak about how this worked out in your own professional life?
In my own professional life, I'll tell you. My husband and I did everything together, and he volunteered to get up and deal with the children in the middle of the night. So, but very few people are as good as he is. So, and we always spent a lot of money. We commodified our household work to the nth degree. 2 weeks. Yes. I had a neighbor, by the way, who had a baby at home by natural childbirth and went downtown the next day.
I really actually am very happy to hear you talk about the problems of having this paid parental leave. And I think one of the reasons is that it really atomizes women in the household, sucks them in. And I know, and I've seen more and more of my female colleagues and friends and relatives really buy into what I think is a propaganda machine about how fulfilling and enriching staying home with your children is. I mean, we have the baby story on the Learning Channel, for example, but then, getting the phone calls in the middle of the night, I'm so bored, I want to rip my hair out, I'm dying to have a conversation with a human being. But I think one of the problems we have at K-State is that faculty don't even get 6 weeks to, let an incision heal, where they have to go back.
Well, I think, there's a difference between recovery from physical trauma, and as I say, many people work up to the minute the baby is delivered and then are fine the next day. Others may have long-term problems of healing and follow-on of problems. I mean, it's obviously, but there's a difference between essentially sick leave and child-raising leave.
Yeah, I'd like to see it as well.
I mean, there were some lawsuits about 15 years ago where women where employers were covering every type of sickness or injury, including, facelifts and ski accidents and what have you. And they weren't covering childbirth. the expense of childbirth, or the giving sick leave for recovery from childbirth. That went to the Supreme Court. They sued and said it was a violation of the anti-discrimination law, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. You won't believe this, but the Supreme Court said no, it's not a violation because men have nothing like that. So we're not treating women differently than men because, so they said, employers don't have, but wait, there's a happy ending to the story. People became so annoyed at that Congress actually passed a law saying they had to do it. So now you can, employers have to, assuming they cover everything, they have to cover illness or disability based on physical birth giving. But child raising leave is a different story. Yeah.
Is it ethical for women to perpetuate their own oppression by this commodification of household labor? Because when I think of childcare staff and when I think of maids to come in and do those sorts of things, I think of women and women who are ethnic minorities. How can we be more ethical in pursuing things in the quote-unquote male world, such as professions?
Okay, I think that's a very good question, and it has been addressed. For example, Barbara Ehrenreich writes about it all the time, and Hochschild wrote about it too, Arlie Hochschild. And they take the point of view that you're taking, that middle-class women, middle-class white bourgeois women perhaps, are just putting off oppression onto their sisters of color, immigrants, so on. And isn't that terrible? Well, what's terrible about it? First of all, if this is low-paying work, if I can hire somebody cheaply to care for my child, is that a problem of mine? No. Who sends this person to me cheaply? It's all the employers who won't hire her for something better. Okay? They're the ones who are oppressing her, not the one who actually gives her a job. Now, we never hear it said men shouldn't give their shirts to the laundry. They should do them themselves because it's low-paid work that gets them washed and ironed. Nobody ever says that, you see? So this argument is something used only on women. Now, there are really two issues here. Whether the work ought to be commodified and the conditions under which it ought to be commodified, and our friend over here and I discussed that earlier. I'm certainly in favor of ending discrimination in the workplace against women. No question about people of color. No question about that. That I haven't emphasized that tonight, but it's certainly one of the most important things we need to do to get equality. So if we, you could argue that child care ought to be highly paid because it's responsible, it should take some intelligence, and so on. We want a high-type individual to do it. The problem is that, unfortunately, it's hard to articulate that point of view because we officially have the attitude that anybody can raise a child, provided she gives birth to it, you see. So it doesn't take any particular... in writing this book on childcare, that wonderful point came to me. That's the story there. I don't view hiring household help as disgraceful or exploitative. What I view as disgraceful is anybody who denies somebody a job because of their gender or race and forces them into certain other kinds of occupations. Does that?
So would you say that it's then men who create this problem, male gendered professions who exclude women that create it, or is it the fault of the women who accept that, or the families actually who accept that this is the case, and then, you know, take their laundry, men who take their laundry out, which is seen as a female gendered profession, and pay them less because of it?
Well, you know, as to who's doing the discriminating in employment, well, I think men have tended to have more power than women, but I know cases where women have the power and do it, discriminate. There was a wonderful advertisement for Smith & Wollensky, which is a very fancy New York steak house, and it had the pictures of 60 men, count them, 100% men, and it said, it's not only our steaks that are aged, it's our waiters. These waiters have been with us 15 years. So I called them up, and I said, don't you have any women? Or maybe you have some women who haven't been with you 15 years, so that's how they didn't get into the picture. No, we don't have any women waiting. How come? Well, they don't seem to want this job. Well, of course, that's a very high-paying waiting job, waitress job, waiter job. So who was that I spoke to? She said, I do all the hiring, and I don't discriminate. The hell she doesn't. So, you know, when women are sort of inducted into the service of a regime, they pretty much have to follow the rules. You know, there were female concentration camp guards, too. Sorry to tell you.
Well, please join me again in thanking Dr.